He called her girl. Not ma'am. Not miss. Not even you. Just girl. Like she was 12. Like she wasn't wearing a tailored navy blazer. She didn't just park a federal-issued sedan in a judge-only space and walk toward the courthouse steps with a legal portfolio in hand. Like she didn't belong there. And to him, she didn't. Step aside, girl. We're gonna do this my way. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. And he said it loud. Loud enough for the others at the federal courthouse security checkpoint to hear. Loud enough for the white bailiff next to him to smirk and look away. Loud enough for Amira Langston's spine to stiffen, not from fear, but from fury simmering just beneath her skin. She looked him in the eye. Calm. Unblinking. Excuse me. But Deputy Martin Griggs had already turned his back, motioning to a younger officer to redirect foot traffic. The line behind Amira hesitated, unsure whether to watch or pretend this wasn't happening. That was always the dilemma in these moments. Bystanders rarely picked sides. They picked silence. I said step over there. Griggs jerked a thumb toward a side hallway. Secondary screening. Amira didn't move. She didn't have to. She'd walked through that same checkpoint 100 times, hell, 1,000. She knew the routine. She knew the scanners. The protocols. The Constitution. She knew her rights. But Griggs didn't care. He saw a black woman with a steel gaze and silver curls twisted tight to her scalp. He saw someone who didn't defer, didn't shrink, didn't smile just to make him comfortable. And in his world, that was reason enough. Is there a problem? Amira asked again, steady but firm. Griggs stepped closer. Too close. The kind of closeness meant to dominate a space, to bend the air toward himself. You look suspicious, he said flatly. No ID displayed. That's a violation. I'm not required to display ID unless requested. And I just. Before she could finish, he reached for the badge clipped inside her blazer. Snatched it. Didn't even glance at it before slipping it into his back pocket like it was a napkin. Amira's jaw clenched. You need to return that. You need to follow directions, sweetheart. The word sliced through her. Not because it was crude, but because it was familiar. A weaponized intimacy. The kind used to remind women like her of their place. Griggs pointed down the hallway again. Now. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Amira took a breath. Just one. Then she walked. Not because she was afraid. Not because she didn't know how to push back. But sometimes silence is a strategy. And because she knew that the courtroom just beyond that hallway would be hers. He didn't know that yet. But he would. The hallway was quiet. Too quiet. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. The floor tiles, once white, were dulled by time and scuff marks. A windowless room waited at the end, a side screening chamber used, supposedly, for enhanced protocols. Amira stepped in. Alone. Griggs followed. There was a single steel chair in the center. A small rolling cart stood nearby with various devices, wands, scanners, and clippers. The door clicked shut behind her. Amira turned. I do not consent to this search, she said clearly. You have no legal cause. You're acting nervous. That's 'cause enough. Griggs moved toward the cart. Picked up the clippers. They buzzed to life with a sound that filled the room like a hive awakening. Amira's heart thudded. Once. But she stood still. You're not serious, she said. Her voice was ice. Griggs didn't answer. Another officer entered. Younger. Pale. Shaky. He didn't speak either, just grabbed Amira's left wrist as Griggs stepped behind her. "Sit," Griggs ordered. "I won't." He shoved her. Amira stumbled into the chair. She didn't cry out. She didn't plead. But her fingers tightened into fists in her lap. "This is a federal offense," she warned. "You're detaining a federal officer without cause. You're lying." "You're nobody," he said, almost laughing. "Probably some legal assistant trying to sneak something in." Amira's eyes burned. But she didn't blink. Then the clippers touched her scalp. The cold metal vibrated against her skin as the first thick coil of silver hair fell past her shoulder and hit the floor. Another followed. And another. She stared straight ahead. The younger officer shifted. Uneasy. But silent. The third guard laughed. "Damn. She looks better already." Amira said nothing. But inside, something cracked. Not like glass. Like thunder. Griggs brushed loose hair from his sleeve, then stepped back. "You're free to go." He tossed her badge onto the desk like trash. "Courtrooms that way," he said mockingly, gesturing toward the door. Amira stood. Slowly. Shoulders square. Back straight. Hair gone. Not broken. She picked up her badge. Didn't thank him. Didn't look at him. Just walked. Each step down the corridor was heavier than the last. Not from pain, but from purpose. Something deeper than rage, sharper than humiliation. Because what Martin Griggs didn't know, what none of them knew, was that she wasn't there to watch a trial. She wasn't there to sit in the gallery. She was in the courtroom. She was the bench. Judge Amira Langston was there to preside. And she was about to do it bald, bruised, and brilliant. Outside the courtroom doors, the sounds of the morning's hearings hummed faintly, shuffling papers, murmured voices, the clinking of water pitchers. Inside her chest, the clippers still buzzed. Phantom pain. Phantom shame. She pushed both doors open. Heads turned. And the air stilled. Her heels clicked against the marble floor as she walked past rows of attorneys, journalists, and defendants. Some blinked, confused. Others stared openly at her scalp, raw and uneven. She ignored them all. At the front of the room, the judge's bench stood empty. Waiting. She stepped behind it. Only then did some people understand. Whispers rose like smoke. "She's the judge. That's her. Oh my God." Amira reached for her robe, folded neatly over the chair. She didn't ask for help. She didn't wait for formality. She slipped it on herself. One slow, deliberate movement at a time. Like armor. Then she turned, faced the room, and said the words that silenced everything. "Court is now in session." The silence wasn't quiet. It was thunderous. It echoed off the courtroom's polished walls, settled between marble columns and stiff-backed benches. A silence too full to be empty. The kind that sucked the air from lungs and froze gestures mid-motion. Amira Langston stood behind the bench, robe now cloaked over her raw, exposed scalp. The chair that had once symbolized impartiality and power was hers. But it didn't feel ceremonial today. It felt earned through fire. She sat. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Just, deliberately. The leather groaned beneath her weight as if remembering who she was. Eyes followed her like ghosts. Some looked away in shame. Others couldn't tear themselves from the sight. The courtroom had never seen anything like this. The woman they had watched be escorted through the hallway like a detainee, shaved and violated without protest, was not a bystander. She was the judge. And now, the rules had changed. The courtroom clerk, a man in his early 30s with thick glasses and nervous hands, fumbled with the docket. "Why, Your Honor," he stammered. "We're scheduled to begin the misconduct hearings, Case 2301B, United States vs. Charleston Police Department." Amira's voice was a blade. "Are all parties present?" A shuffle. A murmur. "Yes, Your Honor," the clerk said, straightening. "Proceed," she said. No one moved. The prosecution table sat rigid. Three attorneys in sleek suits who hadn't prepared for this, hadn't imagined this courtroom being anything other than routine. The lead prosecutor, a woman named Dana Wexler, blinked twice and then stood. Her composure was clipped, but her eyes burned with something deeper, understanding. "The people call Officer Travis Neal to the stand," she said. Neal was a tall man with military posture and a clean-shaven jaw, dressed in a gray suit that didn't hide his discomfort. He stepped forward like a man walking onto a battlefield. He thought he'd win. He was wrong. Amira watched him approach. She didn't blink. Didn't nod. She simply stared, and that was enough. Neal sat, placed his right hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. He adjusted the mic. "Officer Neal," Wexler began. "You were present during the protest on June 19 last year, correct?" "Yes, ma'am." "You were assigned to crowd control duty in front of City Hall?" "Yes." Wexler's tone sharpened. "Were you the officer who deployed tear gas into a group of unarmed demonstrators, including elderly individuals and minors?" A pause. "Then, I was following orders." Amira's voice broke in, crisp and cold. "Was it your order?" "No, Your Honor," he replied quickly. "But you carried it out anyway." "I had reason to believe the crowd was becoming hostile." "Were any weapons recovered from the group?" "Not that I saw." Amira leaned forward, her fingertips tapping gently on the bench. "So, to clarify, no weapons were seen, but tear gas was deployed on civilians, including a 13-year-old child who was hospitalized for chemical burns." A longer pause. "Yes, Your Honor." Her eyes didn't leave his. "Continue, Counselor." Wexler nodded, flipping her notes. The testimony rolled on, facts and denials, body cam gaps, protocol excuses. Amira absorbed every word like water seeping into dry ground. But her expression never shifted. Not once. Every time the word procedure was used, a vein ticked in her temple. Every time someone said, "We were just doing our job," something behind her eyes flashed. Because that's what Griggs had said, too. When the cross-examination ended, Amira called for a brief recess. The moment she rose, the courtroom followed. Not because the clerk announced it. Not because the bailiff barked the order. They stood because she stood. And no one dared remain seated. In the judge's chambers, the silence returned. Not the oppressive kind, but the reflective kind. The kind that lets rage melt into clarity. She stared at her reflection in the mirror above the wash basin. Her scalp was patchy, red in places where the clippers had dug too close. But it wasn't the physical damage that struck her, it was the contrast. The face staring back wasn't unfamiliar. It was the same Amira Langston. Same eyes. Same mind. Same spine of steel. And yet, without her hair, the world had treated her as something less worthy, less dignified, less human. She ran a finger along the raw skin near her temple. The humiliation had been brutal. But the clarity it gave her. Brutal too. And brilliant. There was a knock. Her clerk entered, eyes lowered respectfully. Your Honor, Deputy Griggs is still stationed outside the courtroom. Should we remove him? Amira didn't answer immediately. She turned slowly from the mirror. No. The clerk hesitated. No, he echoed. He will stand there, she said, until I say otherwise. The clerk nodded and left. Amira looked at herself one last time, then turned away. This wasn't about appearance anymore. It was about presence. When she returned to the bench, the gallery had filled in again. Not just the lawyers. Not just the defendants. But the public. Some had caught word of the incident. Some had seen something on social media. But most had simply felt something shift in that building, and had come to see if it was true. Amira adjusted her robe and tapped the gavel once. Court is back in session. The next witness was called. A woman. Late 20s. Shy. African American. Her name, Melinda Casey. She wore a gray cardigan and gripped a handbag as if it held her spine. She was a former intern in that very courthouse. Quiet. Bright. Full of hope, until Griggs happened. Wexler approached her gently. Miss Casey, can you tell the court what happened on April 4th of last year? Melinda swallowed. Hard. I came in early. Before opening hours. I had my badge, but it wasn't clipped to the front. It was in my purse. And what happened? I was stopped by Deputy Griggs. He said I was sneaking around. I explained who I was, showed my badge. And did he accept that? Tears welled up in her eyes. No. He said, girls like me don't belong back there. Then he told me to spread my arms. I didn't understand. I said I was a legal intern. And what happened next? Her voice dropped. He pressed me against the wall. Pat searched me. Said it was protocol. Wexler took a moment before speaking. Did anyone intervene? No. Did you file a complaint? Melinda nodded. And what was the result? Dismissed. Lack of corroborating evidence. There it was again. That phrase. As hollow as it was cruel. Amira looked at the defense table. Stone-faced. Then at Griggs by the door. He looked like he wanted to vanish. After the testimony, Amira called a second recess. But this time, she stayed seated as the room emptied around her. When the last door closed, she looked up. Deputy Griggs, she said. Her voice was a piano key struck hard. He flinched. Approached the bench. The room was empty but for them. Griggs walked slowly. Not the way he walked that morning. Gone was the swagger. Gone was the arrogance. He reached the center of the courtroom, stood before her like a schoolboy before a principal. She didn't ask for his name. She didn't ask for his title. She simply stared. Then, finally. Why? He blinked. Your Honor, I didn't know. That's not what I asked. I thought. You thought I was no one. Yes. The word fell like a weight. Amira leaned forward. And if I had been no one? If I hadn't taken this bench? What would have happened? Griggs looked away. She didn't stop. Would I have gone home with my scalp bleeding and my dignity shredded? Would you have laughed about it over lunch? Filed no report? He didn't answer. She stood. Walked down from the bench. Stood only inches away. I was not your first victim. We both know that. Still, he said nothing. And I will make sure I'm your last. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't have to. Return to your post, she said. Until further notice. He turned, pale, and walked like a man carrying chains. The courtroom doors opened again. The next witness entered. And Amira? She sat back on the bench. Back where she belonged. Only now, she owned it differently. There were files. Boxes of them. Thick manila folders stacked 5 high, each labeled with case numbers, incident codes, and the silent indifference of bureaucratic ink. But it wasn't the size of the stack that chilled the room, it was the label on the front of the first box. Deputy Martin Griggs, Internal Affairs Complaints, closed without action. When the clerk wheeled them in on a metal cart, the courtroom stopped breathing. The wheels squeaked like something ancient had just been disturbed, something meant to stay buried. Judge Amira Langston adjusted her robe and stood. These documents, she said, her voice razor sharp, were obtained this morning through an expedited subpoena issued under judicial discretion. She looked out across the courtroom. For the record, they contain 12 formal complaints filed over the last 15 years against Deputy Martin Griggs by civilians, employees, and legal professionals, each one closed with no further action. Her gaze landed on the defense table, then swept the prosecution, then the gallery. Until today. A murmur rippled through the crowd. From the back row, someone gasped. The defense attorney rose, James Collier, tall, gray-templed, Harvard-polished. He adjusted his cuffs like he still had control. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "we were not informed of the existence of these files until this very moment. This blindsides the defense and—" "You'll have your copy," Amira cut in, holding up a duplicate folder. "And you may review it during recess. For now, I'd like to enter these materials into evidence." Unsealed. Collier hesitated. "We object." Overruled. The gavel struck once. Not loud, but final. The courtroom went silent again. Not fearful. Reverent. Like history was unfolding, and they knew it. Amira turned to the prosecution. "Please call your next witness." Dana Wexler nodded, her jaw tight with focus. She didn't shuffle her notes this time. She didn't need them. The people called Carol Jennings. From the left entrance, a woman emerged. Mid-60s. Black. Shoulder-length gray hair, pressed into soft waves. Thick glasses. She wore a navy blue pantsuit, but her walk had the quiet confidence of someone who had walked those courthouse halls for decades, and carried every secret with her. When she reached the stand, Amira straightened. She knew who Carol was. Everyone did. Carol had been the courthouse's senior records officer for over 20 years. The woman who trained interns, whispered warnings, and kept things running when judges came and went. She wasn't just staff, she was memory. "Ms. Jennings," Wexler began gently, "how long did you serve at the Charleston Federal Courthouse?" 23 years, ma'am." "And what was your official role?" "Senior Records Supervisor." "In that capacity, were you responsible for filing and archiving internal complaints made against courthouse personnel?" "I was." "And did that include Deputy Martin Griggs?" A pause. "Then, yes." Wexler stepped forward. "Can you describe for the court what typically happened to those complaints once filed?" Carol looked toward the bench, toward Amira, then toward the crowd. "They disappeared," she said. A single word. Heavy as a dropped anchor. Amira leaned forward. "Please elaborate, Ms. Jennings." Carol removed her glasses, wiped them with a cloth from her pocket, and returned them to her face. Her voice was steady, but it carried the tremor of buried truths. When a complaint was submitted, formal or informal, it would be logged, assigned a number, then passed along for review. That's protocol. But when it came to Griggs, things changed. How so? Wexler asked. Many of his complaints were never reviewed. Some were removed from the system entirely. Others were marked resolved when no action had been taken. Who had the authority to close these files? Carol's lips thinned. Only two people, the chief judge and the head of courthouse security. A hush fell over the room. Wexler nodded. And during the majority of these complaints, who was the presiding chief judge? Carol swallowed. Judge Terrence Mahoney. Amira went still. There it was. The name. The one she had hoped, prayed, wouldn't surface. But it did. Terrence Mahoney. Her mentor. Her advocate. The man who had told her she was the face of the future bench. The one who had sworn she could change the system from within. The one who had written her letters of recommendation. The one who had presided when she was sworn in. And now, the one whose signature had closed 12 doors on 12 cries for help. Amira exhaled slowly and silently. Do you have documentation to support your claim? Wexler asked. I brought copies, Carol said, gesturing to a binder she carried. The clerk retrieved it and handed it to the bench. Amira opened the folder. There it was. Complaint hashtag 12-447, excessive force used by Deputy Griggs on civilian woman, hair pulled and slammed into wall. Status, dismissed. Signed, T. Mahoney. Date, May 14, 2017. Complaint hashtag 09-218, unauthorized search of black male legal intern. Status, unfounded. Signed, T. Mahoney. Date, January 9, 2012. Complaint hashtag 16-780, verbal intimidation, racial epithets used toward staff. Status, closed. Signed, T. Mahoney. No investigation. Amira's hands trembled slightly. But only slightly. She looked up. Her voice was cold steel wrapped in velvet. Ms. Jennings, why are you bringing this forward now? Carol looked at her with tired eyes. Because what happened to you shouldn't have happened to anyone. And because I couldn't stay silent anymore. The courtroom was still. Amira whispered, "Thank you." Wexler nodded to the judge. No further questions. Carol left the stand. The gallery watched her go, not just as a witness, but as someone who had carried the truth for too long. Amira turned to the court. "I'd like a 5-minute recess." The gavel fell again. In her chambers, Amira stood by the window, watching the leaves stir outside. October was shifting. The air was cooler, but the heat in her chest was building. Her clerk entered quietly. Judge Mahoney left a message. "He's requesting a meeting." Amira turned. "What did he say?" "He said he'd like to clarify context before the press gets involved." She laughed once. A short, bitter sound. "Tell him I'll see him, on the record." The clerk hesitated. "Yes, Your Honor." Amira turned back to the window. The system wasn't just cracked. It was complicit. And it had a name. When the court resumed, Amira didn't sit immediately. She stood behind the bench, eyes sweeping the room. "There are moments in a courtroom that feel like routine," she began. "And then there are moments that feel like rupture." She held up the binder. "These documents represent more than misconduct. They represent a choice made repeatedly by those in power, to ignore, to conceal, and to permit harm under the illusion of order." The air went cold. "I will not pretend this courtroom is immune. I will not pretend this institution is clean. But I will say this, starting now, this court will not be silent." She looked at the defense table. "You may review these files during recess. Tomorrow, we continue with testimony. And I suggest you come prepared, not to protect your client, but to confront a system that has protected him far too long. She sat. The court adjourned. But no one stood. They just watched. Because something had cracked open. And nothing would be the same. It started with a cough. A small, nervous sound from the back of the courtroom. It might have gone unnoticed on any other day. But not this one. Not after Carol Jennings' testimony. Not after the 12 complaints had been made public. Not after the name Terrence Mahoney had echoed through the room like the fall of a once untouchable god. So when the cough came, followed by the scrape of a wooden bench, every eye turned. An older black man stood, slowly, as if gravity weighed heavier on his back than anyone else in the room. He wore a brown corduroy blazer. His shoes were scuffed, not from carelessness, but from time. His hands trembled, not from age, but from memory. He cleared his throat and raised his voice. "Your Honor." Judge Amira Langston looked up from the bench. Her voice was soft. "State your name for the record." "Louis Bryant." "And why are you standing, Mr. Bryant?" He didn't move. Just gripped the bench in front of him. "Because I filed one of those complaints." The room shifted. Every chair leaned an inch forward. Every breath caught mid-inhale. Amira nodded once. "Proceed." He licked his lips, glanced around, and began. "It was October. 11 years ago. My daughter had a family court hearing. Custody case. She was young, scared, and I came to support her. I spoke up during the recess, just asked why the judge didn't hear her testimony." He paused. Looked at Griggs, who sat across the room like a statue carved in gilt. Deputy Griggs grabbed me. Slammed me into a wall near the lobby. Broke 2 of my ribs. No one spoke. Bryant continued, "I filed the report. Got a form. Submitted medical records. They told me it was under review. A week later, I got a call that said the case was closed. Said I fell. That's what they wrote in the report. That I tripped." He laughed once, bitterly. "I ain't tripped, Your Honor. I was thrown." Amira's hands were clasped tightly in front of her. "Did you try to follow up?" "Twice. The second time, they said if I made more noise, it might hurt my daughter's case." A slow murmur rose from the gallery. Amira stood. "Anyone else?" she asked. Not loud. But clear. The silence cracked. A woman in a red head wrap raised her hand. Then another, young, no more than 21, voice trembling as she said, "I was searched in the stairwell, even though I was a witness." Then a man with salt and pepper dreadlocks stood. He called me a thug. I was here to testify as a teacher in a youth mentorship case. And then, like floodgates ruptured, the voices poured out. I worked in custodial services. He cornered me in the break room, said I was snooping. Pinned me to the wall. I'm a paralegal. He made me empty my purse in front of a group of attorneys. Nothing was found. He said I looked too confident to be a juror. Made me wait an hour while he double-checked my summons. They stood one after the other. Some shaking. Some crying. Some angry. But none are silent anymore. Griggs didn't look at them. He stared at the floor. The same floor he'd once patrolled like a king in a stone castle. Now it was quicksand. And he was sinking. Amira's voice rose above the murmurs. If you wish to have your testimony officially recorded, please submit your names to the clerk before the end of today's session. This court will not ignore your voices. One of the women, elderly, stepped forward gently. She placed her hand on the wooden divider between the gallery and the aisle. "I don't need paperwork," she said. "I just needed to be heard. I've waited 30 years. A soft ripple of applause stirred and then quickly fell silent as Amira raised a hand. "This is a court of law. But it is also, starting today, a place of truth." She turned to the prosecution. "Call your next witness." Dana Wexler stood, but before she could speak, the back doors of the courtroom swung open. 2 U.S. Marshals entered. The gallery stiffened. Even Amira's eyes narrowed. The lead marshal, a tall black man in his 50s, nodded politely. "Your Honor, apologies for the interruption. I believe our presence has been requested." Amira blinked. Then remembered. An hour earlier, her clerk had whispered about a former officer asking to testify, one who had once worked in this very courthouse. "State your name for the record," she said. The man stepped forward. "Andrew Taylor. Retired U.S. Marshal. Served from 1997 to 2019. Stationed at this courthouse for 9 of those years. And what brings you forward today, Mr. Taylor?" He looked around, then locked eyes with Griggs. "I was here when it started." "When he started?" "Clarify." "At first, it was attitude. He'd bark orders at black attorneys, even judges. Said it was for security. He'd smirk when he made someone empty their bags." Taylor's voice dropped lower. "But then came the rough stuff. Physical intimidation. He grabbed people. Took them to the side room. No cameras there." Amira leaned forward. "Did you report this behavior?" Taylor nodded. "I did. Internal memo. Sent it up the chain. And they told me he was the kind of man we need in tough situations. Said I should focus on my post." He paused. "I didn't speak up again. I told myself it wasn't my fight. That if I raised hell, I'd be transferred, or worse, branded as the angry black officer." He took a step toward the bench. "I've regretted that silence ever since." Amira's throat tightened. Not with pity, but with recognition. That feeling. That pressure. To choose between presence and peace. And the crushing guilt of choosing silence when you knew better. "Thank you, Marshal Taylor," she said softly. "No, Your Honor," he replied. "Thank you." Recess was called shortly after. But no one moved quickly. People lingered in the gallery. Some hugged quietly. Others exchanged contact info. Strangers who had sat in silence together for hours now stood united by something deeper than law. Shared history. Shared harm. Shared hope. In her chambers, Amira removed her robe and placed it gently on the back of her chair. She looked at herself in the mirror again. But this time, she didn't flinch. There was no shame. Just gravity. There was a knock at the door. Her clerk entered with a small envelope. "This was dropped off by Reverend Marcus Hill," she said. "He's out front with a group of community leaders." Amira opened it. Inside was a list. Dozens of names. Handwritten. Each one followed by dates, phone numbers, and brief notations. Victims. Witnesses. Stories waiting to be told. At the bottom was a note in careful cursive. "These are the people who never got called to the stand. But they're ready now." Amira swallowed hard. She hadn't just opened a case. She'd opened a wound. And for the first time in decades, the wound was being cleaned, not covered. She stepped outside the chambers into the back hallway. The building was quieter than usual. But there was a hum in the air. A shift. She paused before re-entering the courtroom. From the other side of the door, she could hear muffled voices. Not arguing. Not chaos. Movement. Momentum. She placed her hand on the knob. Then paused. Behind her, her clerk stood, wide-eyed. You all right? She asked. Amira didn't turn. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. She pushed the door open. The courtroom rose. No one had to tell them to. It wasn't about protocol anymore. It was about presence. Judge Amira Langston took her seat. She tapped the gavel once. And then looked at the defense. Is your next witness ready? She asked. James Collier rose, slower than before. He looked smaller. We request a continuance, Your Honor. Amira smiled. Not kindly. Request denied. The gavel struck again. The reckoning was no longer coming. It was here. Your Honor, before we proceed further, the defense would like to make a formal motion. The voice was smooth. Too smooth. James Collier rose from his seat with the slow confidence of a man who thought he still held the reins. He adjusted his lapel, glanced at the reporters scribbling in the gallery, then fixed his gaze on Amira Langston. We respectfully request that you recuse yourself from these proceedings. A sharp inhale swept through the courtroom like a gust of cold air. The temperature didn't drop, but the mood did. Eyes widened. Heads turned. The murmurs came quickly, like waves lapping before a storm. Amira didn't blink. She remained seated. Regal. Silent. On what grounds? She asked, voice even. Collier cleared his throat. In light of recent events, your direct interaction with the defendant Deputy Griggs, the very public nature of that interaction, and the subsequent attention it's received, there exists a reasonable concern regarding your ability to remain impartial. Reasonable, Amira repeated softly. Yes, Your Honor. This is not a reflection on your integrity, only on the appearance of bias. Amira leaned forward, her eyes fixed on him like a hawk mid-dive. You're suggesting, she said, that because I was assaulted by this man in the very building I serve, in the role I was appointed to fulfill, because I was humiliated, stripped, degraded, because of all that, I'm too compromised to judge fairly. Collier raised his hands in a gesture of feigned diplomacy. We simply believe it would be best for the integrity of the court. No, Amira interrupted, standing now. Her robe flowed as she moved down from the bench. She walked slowly, deliberately, each step echoing with authority. Let me tell you what compromises the integrity of this court, she said. It's not that I was attacked. It's not that I sit here with uneven hair and bruises on my scalp. She paused in the center of the room. What compromises this court is the fact that 12 complaints were buried. That a man was allowed to operate unchecked because he knew who would protect him. That an entire building, an entire system, decided it was easier to keep him in uniform than to admit failure. Amira turned slowly, her voice sharper now. You speak of appearances. But what did this court look like to the dozens of people who were searched, detained, touched, silenced, just because they didn't look like they belonged? Collier tried to respond, but the words caught. Amira advanced. Let me be clear, Mr. Collier. I did not ask to be attacked. I did not ask to become a symbol. But since that choice was made for me, since this courtroom made me its victim, then I will not be pushed aside while others decide what justice should look like in my absence. She returned to the bench. The motion is denied. Gavel strike. One clean note. Final. The gallery didn't cheer. They didn't clap. But they sat straighter. They looked harder. And somewhere in that stillness, something fundamental shifted. Again. This time, it was permanent. Dana Wexler stood. Your Honor, the prosecution has no further witnesses for today. Amira nodded. Then I'd like to take this moment, she said, to address the court on a matter of immediate judicial importance. She reached beneath her bench, drew out a sealed envelope, and broke the wax. From within, she pulled a document, clean, crisp, no dust of history. Something new. She held it up. This, she said, is a policy proposal I've drafted in collaboration with civil rights attorneys, courthouse personnel, and external oversight advisors. She set it on the bench like a gauntlet. It is called the Langston Protocol. The name hung in the air like a rising note. Reporters sat up. Pens froze. Even Griggs looked up for the first time in hours. This protocol, Amira continued, will mandate the following within this courthouse jurisdiction: mandatory anti-bias and psychological evaluations for all bailiffs, courthouse deputies, and security personnel every 6 months. A few in the gallery gasped. Second, she continued, body cameras will now be worn and operational at all times during civilian interaction, including screening rooms. She wasn't done. Third, any complaints of misconduct will trigger automatic review from an external panel comprised of at least 3 community members, 1 civil rights attorney, and 1 federal investigator with no ties to local law enforcement. Now she looked at Collier. Directly, fourth, a zero-tolerance policy. Any verified incident involving excessive force, racial profiling, or civil rights violations will result in immediate suspension pending investigation. No paid leave. No desk duty. No sweeping under rugs that don't belong in courtrooms. Amira paused, then looked to the clerk. Please enter this proposal into the public record and distribute it to all legal counsel present. The clerk took the document with trembling hands. This protocol is not a suggestion, Amira said. It is a demand born from failure. And it will not be debated behind closed doors or watered down in committees. She sat again. I will present it to the circuit. I will present it to the Judiciary Committee. And if I have to, I will present it to the American people. She folded her hands. Because I am not here to simply preside. I am here to protect the dignity that was taken from me, and from so many others. The courtroom fell into an almost holy silence. Then, quietly, someone whispered, Amen. Amira didn't acknowledge it. She didn't need to. It wasn't about reverence. It was about reckoning. The clerk cleared his throat. Your Honor, shall we recess for the day? Amira looked toward the door. The gallery was full. The hallway beyond was buzzing. More witnesses. More voices. More weight. She nodded. Court is adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow. The gavel came down. And the system, the old one, shuddered. Back in her chambers, Amira stood alone. The Langston Protocol sat on her desk, flanked by legal books and news clippings. She stared at it, not with pride, but with solemnity. It wasn't a victory. It was a vow. A knock came at the door. She turned. It was her clerk, eyes wide, holding a phone. It's CNN, she said. They want a statement. Amira shook her head. Tell them the story isn't over yet. The clerk smiled. They said they'll wait. Amira returned the smile, faint but certain. They won't have to wait long. She turned back to her desk, picked up a pen, and began writing. Names. Notes. Next steps. Because policy alone wouldn't save the courthouse. People would. And for the first time in a long time, Amira knew she wasn't alone. It started with 30 seconds of grainy footage. A security camera, angled slightly downward, caught the far end of the courthouse screening room. The timestamp in the upper left corner read 8:13 a.m. The footage was muted. But even without sound, the violence was unmistakable. Deputy Martin Griggs is standing with his back to the camera. Judge Amira Langston is seated. Not in her robe. Not in authority. Just seated. Still. Powerless. And then the clippers. Buzzing. Advancing. Digging into silver coils with a deliberate hand. Hair fell in soft tufts to the floor. One by one. A storm of humiliation. And Amira didn't flinch. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. She just endured. That clip hit the internet at 10:42 p.m., less than an hour after it was quietly leaked to a junior producer at a local affiliate station. Within minutes, it was on Twitter. Then TikTok. Then CNN. Then every screen in America. By midnight, the hashtag Judge Langston was trending globally. By morning, the New York Times, Washington Post, MSNBC, and BBC had all run front-page headlines. Federal judge assaulted in courthouse by deputy, refuses to step down. Charleston reckoning, system on trial. The haircut heard round the country. And the video? 67 million views. And counting. Inside her home, Amira sat in the dark, phone screen lit in her lap. Text messages flooded in, colleagues, former students, retired judges, even members of Congress. Her inbox overflowed. Her voicemail was full. Her public email had crashed 3 times in the last hour. But she hadn't responded to any of it. Not yet. She sat on her living room couch in a loose sweatshirt, barefoot, knees pulled up. A blanket wrapped around her like armor. Her scalp still ached faintly from where the clippers had scraped too close, and though the mirror had grown familiar, the sensation of absence, the missing weight of her hair, was still something her body had not accepted. The news was playing quietly in the background. She didn't look at the screen, but the voices drifted over her like smoke. Some calling it a judicial watershed moment. Policy proposals already being drafted in several other districts. Senator Browning says a hearing may be scheduled. Sources confirm the DOJ is reviewing archived misconduct cases across 5 states. None of it felt real. Until the knock came. She rose slowly, adjusted her sweatshirt, and walked barefoot to the door. It was her clerk. And behind her, 2 men in suits. "Ma'am," one said gently, "we're from the Office of Civil Rights. Department of Justice." Amira nodded, stepped aside, and let them in. They sat at her kitchen table, briefcases opened, folders placed respectfully on the hardwood. They offered her coffee. She declined. The older one, a black man with salt-gray hair and the tired eyes of someone who'd seen too many cover-ups, began. "Judge Langston, you need to know, we've been dispatched by the Attorney General directly. What we've seen. It's unacceptable. And it's actionable." She said nothing. The younger man continued. "We've reviewed internal records, cross-referenced prior complaints, and, well, the problem isn't just Deputy Griggs. It's the entire ecosystem that allowed him to thrive." She raised an eyebrow. "Go on." He opened a folder. Pulled out documents. "Judge Mahoney," he said. "Signed off on every complaint dismissal. Over 15 years. Some of those cases had corroborating witnesses. In one file, a junior bailiff raised concerns and was transferred 6 weeks later to a remote courthouse in South Dakota. And the rot goes deeper than one judge," he said grimly. "The head of courthouse security, 2 former DAs, and even members of the Internal Review Board. They didn't just ignore complaints, they buried them. Any proof?" He slid over a printed email. Amira scanned it. The sender's name chilled her blood. T.Mahoney@uscourts.gov. We cannot afford more press around this issue. Handle it quietly. Griggs may be aggressive, but he's useful. He keeps certain groups in check. Better to leave it alone. She put the paper down slowly. So what now? The elder official leaned forward. We're opening a full-scale investigation. Charleston District Court is under federal review. And Judge Langston, there's a very real possibility that charges may extend beyond Griggs. Her fingers curled slightly around the edge of the table. What about accountability? For those who protected him? He nodded. It's coming. She sat back. Eyes tired. Voice low. Good. By noon, protesters had filled the courthouse steps. It wasn't chaos. It was orderly outrage. Signs rose like declarations. Protect black women. 12 complaints. 0 action. We believe Judge Langston. Silence is complicity. No more hidden hallways. The cameras swarmed. Networks set up tripods. Civil rights leaders arrived from Atlanta, from Chicago, from D.C. It no longer felt like Charleston's courtroom. It felt like the nation's. Inside, Amira resumed court on time. She walked through the side entrance in her robe, but with no announcement. And yet, the entire room stood before her, and even reached the bench. Not out of obligation. Out of recognition. She sat. Tapped the gavel once. Court is now in session. James Collier rose slowly. His posture was changed. Shoulders curled slightly inward. The suit is still sharp, but the man inside, dulled. He didn't say, "Good morning." He didn't say, "Your Honor." He just placed a folder on the defense table and said quietly, the defense would like to submit a revised statement of position. Amira motioned for the clerk to collect it. She scanned the first page. A headline jumped out. Defense counsel withdraws previous motion to recuse. She looked at him. His jaw tightened. I was wrong, he said. You've conducted these proceedings with dignity. I won't contest that again. There was a shift in the room. Not shocking. But something deeper. Validation. Thank you, she said softly. Then turned to the prosecution. Proceed. Wexler rose. We call no further witnesses today. But we do have a new submission, evidence from the Office of Civil Rights detailing institutional patterns of misconduct across 15 years. She placed a binder on the bench. This includes communications, internal memos, and improperly handled complaints. Amira accepted it. Heavy. Literal and metaphorical. I will review. She stood. But instead of calling recess, she looked out across the courtroom. I want to be clear about something, she said. This is no longer about one man, or one hallway, or one moment of violence. This is about a structure. She held up the binder. This is what people mean when they say, the system. Not the abstract idea. Not some monster in the dark. This. Paper trails. Closed doors. Complicity signed in ink. She looked at the gallery, packed shoulder to shoulder. And the only way to fix it is to shine light into every file, every office, every sealed envelope. Her eyes were fierce now. And I intend to do just that. The gavel struck again. Recess. But no one moved. They just sat there, witnessing. Because history wasn't just being written. It was being read aloud. That night, Amira walked the courthouse hallways after hours. The building was quiet. Empty. Still. She paused at the security checkpoint. The one she'd passed through 1,000 times. The one where it all started. It was silent now. The metal detectors are idle. The screening room door closed. But the memory clung to the air. She stepped inside. The chair still sat in the center of the room. The same chair. Same tile floor. But it didn't hold power anymore. It held memory. She stepped up to it. Didn't sit. Didn't touch it. Just looked. Then, quietly, she whispered into the room. You didn't break me. You built the woman who's about to rebuild this place. And then she turned. And walked away. They brought him in through the side door. Cuffed. Head down. No uniform. No badge. Just a pale gray jumpsuit, the word detainee stamped across the back like a brand he could no longer outrun. The courtroom didn't gasp. They didn't need to. They had waited for this moment for days, for weeks, for years. And when Martin Griggs entered the room, no longer the man who barked orders, patted down clerks, or shaved heads in the name of protocol, he looked small. Not humbled. Not remorseful. Just small. Judge Amira Langston was already seated. She hadn't stood for his entrance. She hadn't looked away either. She simply watched. Measured. Cold. Present. Her robe rested over her shoulders like steel. The courtroom behind her was full, press, lawyers, observers, citizens, some of whom had once been told they didn't belong here. But today, they filled every bench, every row, every inch of space. Not as intruders. As witnesses. The bailiff, a new one, announced the case. United States versus Martin Griggs. Charges of abuse of power, civil rights violations, and obstruction of justice. The gavel fell. Court is now in session, Amira said. She glanced toward the defense table. Griggs sat beside a court-appointed public defender, a woman half his age but twice as focused. He wouldn't meet her gaze. Amira turned to the prosecution. Ms. Wexler. Dana Wexler stood. Her eyes are sharp. Her voice is clear. Your Honor, the people will present evidence showing a consistent pattern of misconduct by the defendant over 15 years. We will show that he used his position to intimidate, violate, and dehumanize citizens and staff, many of whom were targeted based on race and gender. She held up a file. We will also present evidence that the defendant deliberately falsified reports, destroyed complaints, and coerced silence through threat and humiliation. And finally, we will demonstrate that this misconduct was sustained and protected by a network of courthouse officials who failed to act, and in some cases, aided in the cover-up. Wexler sat. Amira turned her attention to the defense. The young attorney stood, noticeably nervous. Your Honor, my client is prepared to enter a plea. A beat. Griggs stood, unsteady. Amira looked at him fully now, for the first time since the screening room. Mr. Griggs, she said, how do you plead? He cleared his throat. Eyes low. Guilty. Your Honor. It was barely audible. But the courtroom heard it. Every syllable landed like a drumbeat. Guilty. Amira nodded. A clerk recorded the plea. Then Amira spoke. Mr. Griggs, do you wish to make a statement before sentencing? He hesitated. The room held its breath. He turned slightly toward her, finally meeting her eyes. His voice was rough. Cracked. Hollow. I didn't know who you were, he said. Amira blinked once. Slowly. That's the problem, she said. You never asked. He said nothing more. She stood. And this time, the courtroom rose with him, not from protocol, but from tension, from anticipation, from the pull of gravity itself. She looked down at him. You spent your career deciding who was worthy of respect and who wasn't. You used authority like a weapon, not a shield. You humiliated the people you were supposed to protect. You enforced fear, not order. Her voice was steady. Not angry. Not vindictive. Just true. And when you saw me walk through that hallway without a robe or a title, you decided I didn't matter. Because in your world, power only existed if it looked like you. A long pause. Well, now you're going to sit in the very seat you built for others. She turned to the clerk. Let the record show that Martin Griggs is hereby sentenced to the maximum allowable penalty, 6 years for abuse of power, 5 years for civil rights violations, and 1 additional year for obstruction of justice. She turned back to him. But that's just the legal part. She stepped down from the bench, her voice quieter now. Deeper. The human part is this: you didn't just harm me. You created a culture of silence. You made others complicit. You corrupted the corridors of justice and left scars that will take years to heal. She nodded to the officers. Take him away. As they led Griggs through the side door, no one applauded. No one cheered. They just watched. Because justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's silent. Cold. And finally complete. But the day wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Amira returned to the bench and motioned for the next file. The clerk handed her a thick red folder. On the cover, confidential, internal judiciary oversight. She opened it slowly, deliberately. Before we proceed with new cases, she said, this court will enter into the record a formal motion requesting a Department of Justice investigation into the following individuals. The room froze. She began to read. Judge Terrence Mahoney, former Chief Judge of Charleston District. 12 confirmed instances of complaint suppression. Murmurs. Gasps. Chief of Security Randall Dent, systematic destruction of video files. Heads turned. One man stood up and walked out quickly. Assistant District Attorney Lyle Benson, failure to prosecute filed charges against law enforcement officers despite evidence. The courtroom didn't know whether to listen or hold its breath. So it did both. Amira looked up. I am also recommending that these individuals be placed under immediate ethics review, and, if found guilty, disbarred and charged accordingly under federal statute. She let the silence do its work. Then, she added softly. We are no longer protecting positions over people. Not in this courtroom. Not in this district. Not under my watch. She tapped the folder. And if I must sign every subpoena myself, I will. She stood. And something inside the room lifted, not in celebration, but in release. Like something toxic had finally been named. Confronted. Expelled. Amira gathered her papers. Then paused. There is one final matter. Her clerk handed her a second envelope. She opened it and read aloud. I've received a formal notice from the Senate Judiciary Committee. I've been called to testify next week regarding judicial misconduct oversight and systemic failure within federal courthouses. She looked at the gallery. Reporters scribbled. Phones lit. I intend to testify. Fully. Truthfully. And publicly. She tapped the gavel. Court is adjourned for the day. As she stood to leave, someone in the back row rose. A young law student. She placed her hand over her chest, the way some might during an anthem. Then someone else stood. And another. And another. Until the entire gallery was on their feet again. No command. Just solidarity. Just respect. Just, reckoning. Amira walked out in silence. But this time, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. The storm had passed. Not the kind that flooded streets or snapped tree limbs, but the kind that flooded inboxes, snapped illusions, and washed away decades of silence. And in its wake, something new had taken root. Across the country, headlines didn't just report. They remembered. Editorials weren't just opinions, they were reckonings. Law schools began revising curricula to include real-life cases of systemic bias, using Charleston as the catalyst. Judge Amira Langston wasn't just trending anymore. She was transforming institutions. And she hadn't stopped. 2 weeks after the sentencing of Deputy Martin Griggs, Amira stood on the steps of the Capitol in Washington, D.C., flanked by senators, legal scholars, activists, and dozens of formerly silenced voices. She wore no robe. Only a fitted black blazer, a pair of sharp heels, and a silver pin in the shape of a gavel, gifted to her by a group of young black law students from Charleston University. The sun was warm on her face. The air buzzed with live stream drones above. But down here, on these marble steps, there was stillness. Then her name was announced. She stepped up to the podium. No script. No teleprompter. Just her voice. Just the truth. 3 weeks ago, I was assaulted inside a federal courthouse. 3 weeks ago, I was stripped of my hair, my dignity, and, according to some, my impartiality. But what they didn't strip from me was my authority. Because power doesn't live in uniforms or titles. It lives in conviction. In action. In truth. Cameras clicked. Someone in the crowd whispered, "Yes, ma'am." Amira continued. For years, our justice system has confused order with silence. It has measured respect by obedience, and professionalism by proximity to whiteness, maleness, and sameness. And in doing so, it has failed millions. She looked directly at the sea of journalists, some of whom had doubted her, questioned her, and diminished her. I did not become a judge to wear a robe. I became a judge to protect what the robe is supposed to represent: dignity, fairness, and access. I sat on that bench not to punish, but to listen. And when it was my turn to speak, I did. I still am. She paused. Then lifted a folder from the side of the podium. The Langston Protocol, she said, holding it up. Not just a courthouse policy anymore. This is now a federal proposal, co-sponsored by 8 senators, endorsed by over 30 civil rights organizations. It mandates regular psychological evaluations for courthouse law enforcement, independent citizen-led complaint review boards, mandatory anti-bias training, and federal enforcement of zero-tolerance civil rights violations. This is not reform. This is accountability. The crowd stood. Not roaring. Not shouting. Just rising. As if their bodies had no choice. As if justice had finally said, "Stand with me." And they obeyed. That night, Amira walked out of the Capitol with her sister, Nain. The city lights glowed softly in gold. Traffic murmured in the background. Protesters had become supporters. Doubters had grown quiet. The movement was no longer shouting. It was building. Nain reached out and gently squeezed her hand. "You know, you just changed everything, right?" Amira smiled, but didn't answer. Instead, she looked up at the sky. One silver star shimmered through the city haze. And she whispered, "I didn't change everything. I just refused to be erased." Weeks passed. The Monroe Mandate, the Langston Protocol, and related initiatives spread like wildfire. First in neighboring states. Then California. New York. Minnesota. Community leaders held town halls. Black judges across the country wrote op-eds titled, "We Are Not Silent Anymore." High school civics classes played clips of Amira's speech. Law professors asked students, "What would you have done in that courtroom?" And quietly, steadily, the needle of culture began to move. One morning in late autumn, Amira returned to the Charleston courthouse for a hearing. It was a simple custody case. No cameras. No national headlines. Just a mother. A father. Two attorneys. A child waiting to be heard. But when she walked into the building, every deputy stood. Not because they were told to. Because they chose to. And when she passed the screening room, the one where everything had changed, there was a new sign posted beside the door. Cameras now operational. Dignity required beyond this point. That evening, she visited a middle school. A teacher had invited her to speak to the 7th grade class about what justice means. She entered expecting quiet stares. Instead, she walked into a room covered in hand-drawn posters. Be like Judge Langston. Justice equals truth plus courage. Speak even when it shakes you. A little girl with round glasses and a short afro raised her hand. Judge Langston, do you still have bad dreams? Amira paused. Then smiled gently. Sometimes, she said. But not because of what happened. Because of how long it took for anyone to care. The room fell quiet. Then a boy in the back raised his hand. What do we do when people don't listen? Amira walked toward the chalkboard. Picked up a piece of white chalk. Wrote 3 words. You speak anyway. That night, she stood on her porch under a cold November sky. Nain sat beside her with a cup of tea in hand. The moon cast a pale glow over the neighborhood. No sirens. No shouting. Just wind and truth. I used to think, Amira said, that the system could be fixed from the inside. And now? Nain asked. I think it needs to be cracked open. Exposed. Rewritten. And led by those it once tried to silence. She ran her fingers across her scalp, now covered in short, even curls. It's strange, she said, but I don't want my old hair back. Nain looked over. Why not? Amira smiled. Because I earned this version of me. Scarred, stubborn, and seen. Months later, Amira stood on a national stage again. But this time, it was for something else. The Presidential Medal of Justice. The highest civilian honor for advancing civil rights within the judicial system. The ceremony was elegant. Historic. Televised live. She didn't cry. Not when they said her name. Not when they fastened the medal around her neck. Not even when the president called her a moral compass in a moment of chaos. But she did look out into the audience. And saw them. Louis Bryant. Carol Jennings. Andrew Taylor. Melinda Casey. The girl with the hoodie. The boy with the essay. The janitor who gave her the fist-to-chest salute. The law students who carried her name on notebooks and phone cases, and hearts. She closed her eyes. And exhaled. Not relief. Resolve. When she stepped to the microphone, she paused. Then said, simply. I was never trying to be a symbol. I was just trying to do my job. And not disappear in the process. The audience didn't erupt. They rose. Because standing had become the new language of justice. And Judge Amira Langston had rewritten the dictionary. Powerful message from the story of Judge Amira Langston. The story of Judge Amira Langston is more than a courtroom drama, it's a call to conscience. It reminds us that justice doesn't begin with a title or a robe. It begins with the courage to speak when silence is expected, to stand when you're told to sit, and to lead even when the system tries to erase you. After enduring a public humiliation meant to break her, Judge Langston didn't retreat. She rose, stronger, louder, and more determined, and in doing so, she turned personal pain into public change. For anyone who's ever felt small, unheard, or powerless, this story is proof that you don't need permission to do what's right. Real change doesn't come from those who are comfortable. It comes from those who refuse to be invisible. If this story moved you, like, share, and subscribe to help us spread powerful narratives that matter. Because justice isn't just what happens in court. It's what we choose to stand for, together.